See where the name is.
I know the panels of the morning have stimulated a lot of conversation, and I hate to break it up, but we want to proceed with the remainder of the conference. My name is Alan Luxembourg, and I'm president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. I want to thank the Wilson Center for hosting and co-sponsoring this event, and my colleagues Adrian Basora, Melinda Herring, and Maya Otarashvili for really carrying the burden of bringing about this very excellent conference. I should probably mention that the Institute has probably been doing democracy promotion for over 25 years. In 1987, we held a historic and prescient conference called Will the Communist Regime Survive? Featuring 36 dissidents and exiles from 12 communist countries. And unfortunately, our logistical skills were not as good as our intellectual foresight because the communist regimes fell, and only later did we publish the book of conference papers from that particular conference. But that same year, we also published a journal with help from NED, a Romanian language journal that was circulated in Romania in the years before Ceausescu fell and in the years immediately following, in the attempt to build civil society in that country. And we also, in the early 1990s, worked for 3 years with the Institute of International Relations in Prague, helping to build the think tank that they were, but to introduce American ways of think tanking. And then in 2004, we asked Adrian to take on a long-term project looking at the lessons of democratic transitions, largely, as he said, in the post-communist countries, but then it took on a much larger dimension than that. And that brings us to this conference, which is kind of a summing up of what has happened in democratic transitions in these last 10 years and how we should proceed in the future. Now, it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, who actually doesn't need any introduction. There's no man more identified with the study of democracy and democratic transition than Larry Diamond. But let me just say, he's the author of over 40 books, or editor of 40 books on this subject in all its dimensions. He's now at work on a new book called In Search of Democracy. He is based at the Hoover Institution and the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Relations at Stanford University. He's been a consultant to all the relevant organizations, USAID, NED, the World Bank, the United Nations. Please welcome Larry Diamond.
Alan, thank you for your very warm introduction, and thank you also to Ambassador Adrian Basora and his staff at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and its democracy program here for organizing this meeting and for inviting me to speak. And of course, thanks also to the Kennan Institute for co-sponsoring us. And I should say, just in terms of truth and advertising, the majority of those books have been co-edited with my Journal of Democracy co-editor, Mark Plattner. So we got to give him the equal credit. I do thank you sincerely for organizing this meeting, which comes at an important and volatile time for democracy in the world. I think we'd all agree with that. As we've heard, many people are questioning the viability of democracy and the wisdom of trying to promote it. So I want to begin by trying to set the record straight, at least in my view, on where we are and where we've come in terms of global democracy. My analysis isn't rosy. I don't see how any could be, honestly, given what we've heard and what we know. But it isn't even close to despair either. Then I'll come to some of the challenges and opportunities for democracy promotion, especially by the United States. So to begin, yes, this is a difficult and messy time for democracy and freedom around the world. We've been in a global democratic recession for something like a decade. In each one of the last 8 years, as Freedom House has noted, the number of countries declining in political rights or civil liberties has outpaced by at least 2 to 1 the number of countries gaining in freedom. And this comes after the preceding 15 years of the post-Cold War era, the first decade and a half of the post-Cold War era, when the pattern was precisely the reverse. We had gains in freedom every single year. There have been a lot of democratic breakdowns in this new century. In fact, the rate of democratic breakdown in the last 13 years has been 50% higher than in the preceding period. Since the third wave of global democratic expansion began 40 years ago, 1/3 of all the democratic regimes have failed, and half of these failures have been in the last 13 years. Many of these breakdowns have come in big and strategically important states like Russia, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Venezuela. In some cases, like the Philippines, democracy's been restored. In others, like Thailand, which recently suffered its second military coup in a decade, democracy has broken down repeatedly. In others, like Pakistan and Kenya and Turkey, frankly, the regime seems to occupy a gray zone somewhere in between electoral democracy and electoral authoritarianism. And in Turkey, the authoritarian drift has been so steady, so serious, so prolonged, that I think we now have to recognize that an authoritarian threshold has been crossed. This has long since happened in Sri Lanka and Nicaragua, and Bolivia and Ecuador at least seem to be approaching this same threshold. Democracy has also eroded quite significantly in Africa, where many elected leaders think China's booming aid and investment gives them an alternative to Western conditionality, while the new war on terror more or less does the same. There's also the crushing implosion of the Arab Spring, the growing self-confidence, assertiveness, and cooperation among themselves of authoritarian states like China, Russia, the club of fellow autocracies that they've drawn together, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Iran, and so on. The mounting legal assaults and constraints on civil society, which Carl Gershman spoke about in his remarks, the sharing and development of tools of internet censorship and suppression, and the poor performance of many of the most advanced democracies, beginning with the United States. So yeah, if you care about democracy in the world, we're in trouble. But this is not the whole story. We're in a prolonged political recession, not a depression. We have not yet seen, as I think Carl and others noted, the beginning of a third reverse wave. The extraordinary expansion in the number of democracies halted around 2005, but we've kind of been in equilibrium since then in terms of the total number of democracies, and overall levels of freedom now are lower than they were 7 or 8 years ago, but they're not dramatically and calamitously lower. In fact, there has not been significant erosion in public support for democracy around the world. In fact, what the Afrobarometer has consistently shown, and this is the poorest region of the world where you'd least expect it, is strong continuing support for democratic values and expectations. And a gap, in some African countries, a chasm between the popular demand for democracy and the regime's supply of it. One problem is that the pace of decay in democratic institutions is not always clearly visible. A number of countries we by and large take for granted in this business, such as South Africa, we should not. In fact, there is not, in my opinion, a single country on the African continent where democracy is firmly consolidated and secure, the way I think it is, for example, in some third-wave democracies like South Korea, Chile, and Poland. Add new oil wealth to the mix, as has happened, I think, very sadly in Ghana, and you have a major new challenge to the quality of democratic governance. In the global democracy promotion community, frankly, few actors are paying attention to the growing signs of fragility in the more liberal emerging democracies, not to mention the more illiberal ones. Broadly, we know why democracy and freedom are slipping back. What Frank Fukuyama, my colleague at Stanford, calls neo-patrimonial tendencies are resurgent. Leaders who think they can get away with it are eroding democratic checks and balances, hollowing out accountability institutions, overriding term limits and normative restraints, and accumulating power and wealth for themselves, their families, their cronies, their clients, and their political parties. Space for opposition parties, civil society, and the media is shrinking, and international support for them is drying up. Ethnic, religious, and other identity cleavages polarize many societies that lack well-designed democratic institutions to manage those cleavages. State structures are often too weak and porous, unable to secure order, protect rights, meet the most basic social needs of their citizens, or rise above corrupt, clientelistic, and predatory impulses. Democratic institutions, parties, and parliaments are often poorly developed, and the bureaucracy lacks the policy expertise, and even more so, the independence and neutrality to effectively manage the economy and grow market economy. It isn't easy to develop democracy in poor countries and weak states, and there is a particularly significant failure rate there, but also a non-trivial one in middle-income countries. So if we don't become more focused, more creative, more determined, more resourceful, and frankly, less apologetic in promoting democracy, the democratic recession is going to mutate into a wave of democratic regression, a bleak period for freedom, political stability, and the American national interest. So what is to be done? We need to begin by disaggregating the problem, and I think we should start at the top of the hierarchy of democratic development. I used to add at the end of this kind of lecture, as a final reflective point, what I said in the last chapter of my book, The Spirit of Democracy, physician, heal thyself. That is, we can't be credible and effective in promoting democracy abroad if we don't reform and improve its functioning at home, which was the point Carl made in his opening remarks. That was usually the last imperative I mentioned. Now it needs to be the first. Like many of you who travel widely, I know somebody else made this point during our meeting this morning, I am increasingly alarmed by how pervasive and corrosive is the worldwide perception in both autocracies and democracies that American democracy has become dysfunctional and is no longer a model worth emulating. The prestige, the desirability, and the momentum of democracy globally, as Sam Huntington argued, is heavily influenced by perceptions of how it is performing in the leading examples. If we do not mobilize institutional reforms and operational innovations to reduce partisan polarization, encourage moderation and compromise, energize executive functioning, and reduce the outsized influence of money and special interests in our own politics, how are we going to be effective in tackling these kinds of challenges abroad? Second, I know this echoes another theme that was articulated this morning. We need to be absolutely sure that we have harvested and preserved the low-hanging fruit. That is, we must truly help to consolidate incipient or assumed success stories. One of the biggest mistakes the global democracy promotion community has made over the last 30 years is to cross too many countries off the list of democracy assistance partners and recipients, thinking once the transition is completed and the new democracy lifts off in a middle-income country, they can take care of themselves. Or we say 10 or 20 years of democracy assistance and engagement should be enough. This is all summed up in the term graduation. In my profession, we prefer the term commencement to graduation. And we know that sometimes our graduates still need and deserve our help. A strong and capable state, a genuine rule of law buttressed by a neutral and capable judiciary, effective institutions of horizontal accountability, competent and honest local administration, a pluralistic and resourceful civil society, a culture of tolerance, vigilance, and civic responsibility. These and other foundations of a secure liberal democracy do not get constructed overnight. Many of them emerge gradually with economic development. In more mature economies, they may develop more quickly. But even many of the countries that the World Bank lists as upper middle income are well within the danger zone of democratic decay. And if you look back at where Russia and Venezuela were a decade and a half ago, I think you will see the point. The list of upper middle income countries includes Argentina, which is going through a profound political and economic crisis. Turkey, where the AKP has become a hegemonic party, the press functions in a state of fear, and the opposition parties are in disarray. Romania, an EU country where endemic corruption continues to undermine the health of democracy and governance. South Africa, where a corrupt leadership exhibits visibly declining commitment to the rule of law and liberal values. Thailand, which is now in the grip of a nasty military dictatorship that is not at the moment behaving as if it's transitional. Libya, which had a revolutionary uprising against Gaddafi and then a state collapse. And Tunisia, which could become the one success story of the Arab Spring, but still faces political, economic, and security challenges. A long-term, strategic approach to promoting democracy would make the following resolution. Once a country, and even more especially a middle-income country, achieve or renews democracy, we're going to do everything possible to help lock it into place for the long run. In other words, to consolidate it. That means when a new fragile Libyan transitional government appeals to the United States for security assistance, not occupying troops, we don't say, sorry pals, we helped you get there, now let somebody else help you stay there. It means that we need to go to the new democratically elected Tunisian government after the elections in these next 2 months and ask them, what do you need? What can we do to help revive the economy and rejuvenate flows of tourism and private investment? Beyond our existing programs of party training, election observation, and other assistance, what can we do to support new civil society monitoring and training initiatives, to strengthen independent journalism and policy think tanks, to advance democratic civic education in the schools and the media, to support women's groups, student groups, human rights groups, and any other initiatives to build a culture and civic infrastructure to sustain democracy in Tunisia? If we want to promote democracy in the Arab world for the long run, and I'm not willing to give up on it, and I don't think we can afford, in terms of our national interest, to do so, we should invest very heavily now in Tunisia in every possible way. Because what the Arab world most needs now is one example, just one, of a decent functioning democracy that can serve as a lesson in inspiration and a point of diffusion for the region. The same goes for Ukraine. Of course, the point was mentioned this morning. Even though it's not as economically advanced, Ukraine is at a pivotal point in its history. It cannot afford another democratic regression, or an authoritarian xenophobic Russia may swallow up the rest of it. It is struggling mightily with entrenched patterns of corruption, bad governance, weak institutions. But it has some remarkable actors in the party system, the mass media, and civil society organizations. We need to invest heavily in these people and institutions, and in economic reform and revival and integration with the West in Ukraine. It should be one of the major priorities for United States democracy assistance in the next decade or two. and we need to sustain these investments over an extended period of time in all three critical sectors: the state, the party and representative institutions, the civil society, and, well, for the market economy. It's worth pondering the recent death of an historic democracy NGO in South Africa, IDASA, which has recently just gone out of business. This was one of the trailblazing organizations that came out of the white minority community to resist apartheid and then help create the climate and culture for a peaceful, negotiated transition to democracy. And then it worked to promote democratic civic education and citizen monitoring of parliament and government in South Africa. Some years after Nelson Mandela was elected president and South Africa seemed to have entrenched a liberal democracy with a remarkably rights-affirming constitution, the international democracy promotion community said, well, South Africa's a success story and a relatively rich country. They don't need democracy help anymore themselves, so we'll fund IDASA to help foster democracy in other parts of Africa. It's a very good thing to get the civil societies of emerging democracies involved in cross-border work to build democratic institutions and norms in their regions, but it's a very bad thing to ignore the problems in their own societies. How is a civil society organization that is monitoring and sometimes challenging the incumbent government supposed to raise the resources from within its own society when most of those material resources lie either in the hands of government or in the hands of businessmen and corporations who feel extremely vulnerable to political punishment if they support anti-government activity? The dilemma is repeated over and over in countries that are seen as too rich or too long in democratic experience to justify continued flows of support to civil society organizations. These CSOs, critics say, need to be weaned off the mother's milk of international democracy funding. They need to develop their own sources of revenue. Typically, that's another way of saying they either need to go commercial, maybe by doing surveys for profit or consulting, or they need to seek contracts from agencies of the same government they're supposed to be monitoring, or they need to seek grants to do more mainstream economic and social development work. None of these kinds of activities are intrinsically inappropriate, but they take these organizations away from their original mission, which is to build and monitor democracy. If there are no organizations working mainly or exclusively for that, democracy is going to be in danger. This problem of a shrinking civil society for democracy is a big part of the story of democratic fragility or decay in key emerging democracies, and it is not adequately appreciated by democracy promoters. I know the counter-argument. There's only so much money. How are we going to help the people who have nothing? No financial resources, no protection for their human rights, little or no democracy, if we dilute the available democracy assistance resources by devoting some of them to countries that are comparatively much better off. Here are my responses. First, I dispute the notion that we must view the pool of democracy promotion resources as fixed. It may be, probably is, the case that total resources in the United States for international engagement or international development are fixed. But we need to rethink where the greatest leverage to advance and secure transformative development will lie. Be good if it happened inside this big building here. We need to set the clear goal of achieving and locking in development success stories. And that requires good governance and ultimately democratic governance. Second, we need to take a fresh look at the allocation of democracy and governance assistance resources across our different country programs, instruments, and organizations. What are the most effective instruments and programs for developing state institutions of democracy, political processes, civil society, and so on? Where can we transfer resources from stupid, pointless and even counterproductive democracy and governance programs like the ones that Melinda Herring so effectively shared with us in Azerbaijan to more promising and worthwhile countries and sectors. Third, where democracy, civil society organizations have accumulated a long track record of effective monitoring, civic education, issue analysis, policy reform, civic advocacy, they should become candidates to receive new forms and levels of funding that are not tied to endless cycles of project grants. Rather, they should become candidates for block grants to cover their core operations and to work to fight corruption and defend and improve democracy. Too many civil society organizations that are well established and really serious, in my opinion, spend inordinate amounts of time constantly writing grant proposals for specific projects when their work, their judgment, and their capacity to deliver are well known. Now, I'd like to briefly address in conclusion 3 other issues. One is the global struggle against corruption, the second is the global struggle to defend freedom, and the third is the need to promote universal liberal values. It is hard to find an instance of the breakdown of democracy, and I've studied many of them, in which corruption did not play a leading or at least prominent role. Any long-term campaign to advance and consolidate global democratic progress must have as one of its key elements a war on corruption. This requires bold, comprehensive efforts at every level to transform public norms and capacities to monitor and organize, to help build a capable, well-paid, and meritocratic civil service and police, to help construct and train and resource official accountability institutions to monitor and audit government expenditures and operations, as well as the personal assets of public officials, and to diffuse the norms, the digital tools, and the best practices of open government, right to information, and budget transparency. Beyond this, we need to do much more to track the locations and flows of assets by corrupt government officials, to set new standards of international banking practice, and to marginalize banks that eagerly offer themselves as havens for all sorts of dirty money, not only by drug traffickers and terrorists, but by corrupt politicians. Second, we cannot win the struggle for democracy unless we also wage, Carl made this point as well, a vigorous struggle for liberty and human rights. Too many governments in the world are moving backwards to constrain and punish freedom of speech, freedom online, freedom to organize and assemble, and freedom to receive funding from and form partnerships with international democratic actors. We need to use our tools of conventional diplomacy, public diplomacy, aid and trade relations, and other forms of leverage to call out and condemn these regressions, and to try to defend the individuals and organizations that are bravely working to make their societies freer and more accountable. This is not only a moral but a geopolitical imperative if we are to keep the democratic recession from spiraling into a wave of democratic breakdowns. Autocrats must know that repression is not cost-free, that even while we pursue common interests with them, we are going to speak up for our values and take them into account as we weigh the full range of our bilateral relations. It is a completely false and self-defeating notion to think that in the era of China's rise and Russia's belligerence, we have no more leverage in the world. There is a lot of societal pushback in many of these countries against the growing presence on the ground of autocratic and corrupt foreign powers like China. And particularly in Asia, there is a great deal of anxiety about China's rise. There's no way to understand Burma's political opening except in this context. In Africa and Asia, we have a lot of scope to help civil societies and even governments balance off against a China that is coming on too strong, and the quest for democratic reform can be a common ground in this effort. Finally, I hope we'll remember one thing, above all else. We have the better set of ideas. Democracy may be receding in practice, but it is still ascendant in people's values and aspirations. Some people may accept authoritarian rule as a useful or necessary political order in their minds at a certain historical moment or phase of development. But aside from some self-serving rulers and ruling establishments, few people in the world today celebrate authoritarianism as a superior moral system, the ultimate destination, the best form of government. Democracy remains the only broadly legitimate form of government in the world, and in fact there is a growing hunger, including in authoritarian regimes like China, Iran, Cuba, and Vietnam, to understand what democracy is and how it can be structured to operate effectively and how they can get there. We need to respond to and stimulate this appetite for democratic understanding. We need a comprehensive effort to translate into a number of critical languages. I realize this is a little bit self-serving, but I really strongly believe it. To translate into a number of critical languages a wide range of philosophical, historical, and analytical works on the meaning and forms of democracy, on democratic culture, democratic transitions, democratic constitutional designs, electoral systems, political parties, civil society, systems of horizontal accountability, civil-military relations, and so on. This is what people in these societies are asking for. I know because they're writing me asking me for it. We should be arranging to distribute these translated works for free on the internet, okay, so I surrender my royalties, to develop different levels of instruction in democracy for citizens at different levels of knowledge and need, and to offer a wide range of massive open online courses on various topics and issues related to democracy. Let's also think about how we can make the mobile phone a key platform for the distribution of this knowledge, about how we can make learning about democracy interesting and fun for young people in these countries, and how we can enable more citizens to circumvent internet censorship to get at this knowledge, and how we can use our international broadcasting instruments more broadly and effectively to counter authoritarian propaganda and widen the flow of democratic news, information, and ideas. We should prioritize this battle of information and ideas. It's a battle we can win. The one ultimate trump card we have is the diffuse global recognition, I'm sorry to repeat it, but it bears repeating, that democracy is the ideal form of government, the only permanent basis of ruling legitimacy. This leaves authoritarian regimes like China in a dual dilemma. If they remain frozen in archaic institutions of centralized personal or one-party rule, they sit atop a fragile and brittle regime that could fail at any time. If they adopt the superficial outward form of democracy, multiple parties, elected parliaments and presidents, constitutions that in theory check and balance power, even though in fact they don't, if they adopt these outward forms, they've already conceded the point that democracy is the best system, and then some movement or event may come along to show that they are a fraud. If they keep generating miraculous economic growth, they will produce, as China is now doing, a vibrant and pluralistic middle class that wants or will soon want more freedom and self-determination. If they stop producing rapid economic growth, then the rising new classes will see their dreams shattered and will angrily demand more political voice, which I think is what's going to happen in China in the next decade. A lot in global politics turns on perceptions of dynamism and momentum. This is part of what is meant by the term zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. But the authoritarian spirit cannot speak to the fundamental human aspiration for freedom, dignity, and self-determination. We need to find new ways, new energy, and frankly, new self-confidence to turn that to our advantage. Most of all, we need to promote the spirit of democracy. Thank you.
can stay there as questions.
Open it to questions. So, hands here, right here.
Hi, Mitchell Ernstein from Northeastern University. Thank you, Larry, for that really inspiring talk. I have one question about one difficulty I see that I'd just like your reflections on. In fighting the sort of information war, I don't know if you use that terminology, I think you did, that seems to be emerging where the parties that oppose democracy are increasingly taking to the airwaves with their propaganda. Democracies seem to have a vulnerability in the sense that we can't limit free speech as readily, and also political donations are also a difficult point. Do you have any reflections on that issue, which I see coming up in a number of countries that are beginning to think about, well, should we be limiting this propaganda war against us, and what alternatives there might be to that?
So, when it comes down to RT, Russian television, it gets a little personal for me, and we can talk about that later. But anyway, I do have strong views on this, and of course, the information war has two dimensions. One is really kind of cable television and the conventional radios and the more conventional means of the dissemination of information, and the other is the internet. Let me come to the first one, since that's where you directed it. Vladimir Putin is pouring enormous amounts of money into subsidizing RT. It's really become the cutting edge, in a way, of his international engagement and the, puffing up of his international image and the kind of malicious and opportunistic attacks on the West and on democracy, and of course Soviet-style disinformation, and the offering up of supposed American experts who nobody's ever heard of, to beat up on the United States and constantly parade its maliciousness and failures. And as a result of the money he's putting into this, you travel around, even the United States, but especially around the world, and increasingly you see, RT comes up before CNN or, other American channels and so on. And I think that we need to think about that. There's nothing we can do to suppress Russian television. I certainly wouldn't recommend banning it in the United States. But I do think we can support the competitiveness of our own international private broadcasters of news and information. And in any case, I didn't really have the time to elaborate on this, we could do a lot more to promote our own international broadcasting. And okay, he's upping his game in this terrain, and we need to up ours in a variety of ways. And there are people in this room who know more about how we could do that effectively than I do, but I do think that we need to do more, and do more smartly with respect to international broadcasting. And then I'll just say, I can elaborate it on, if someone wants to, but the constriction, there's another information war, which is the constriction of the internet and our inability to get our message out and for people to seek out democratic news, ties, information, ideas, partnerships on the internet, because access is being blocked. And we have to fight that in the international forums of internet governance, which they're trying to take over, frankly. We need to invest in the technology that can more cheaply and efficiently circumvent internet censorship.
Larry, hi. Thank you very much for this thoughtful and ambitious and encouraging speech. There are two questions. First one, concerning this democratic recession that you're talking about. Certainly, each case is individual. Nevertheless, what do we know, or what do you know, what could you share with us about the common reasons of this democratic recession that is going about a decade? Anything common? Second one is, among those challenges that you have mentioned, there is one really very serious one, is intellectual challenge that is posed by modern autocracies, including China, to some extent Russia, some others, in the sense of, at least for some part of the time, they are growing faster than democracies. For a long time, democracy have been rising faster, they've been much richer, and they are producing by this fact the model, the example to follow. Now, many countries around the world looking at who is offering a more attractive model. And in this regard, these autocracies, these modern autocracies, poses very serious challenge. What can be done about these some kind of the arguments? What could we produce as counter arguments to these modern autocracies, to this new model?
Thank you, Andre. So, in answer to your first question, I think there have been a few characteristic causes of democratic breakdowns in this era. And I said corruption almost always figures prominently. To enlarge it, it's corruption, it's the abuse of power, it's the natural human tendency when institutions aren't strong in their constraining potential to take advantage and get monopoly advantage. A surprising number of the failures of democracy in the third wave and in the last 10 to 15 years have looked a lot more like Russia, Venezuela, now Sri Lanka, I would argue Turkey. You know, it's executives basically strangling the democratic system that brought them to office. And the institutions aren't strong enough to constrain them. Look, there are a lot of people in the world in established consolidated democracies, you know, who come to power and might do the same. They might not even realize that they would do the same if there were no strong constraints. But in the absence of not only strong written constitutions, but well-written constitutions, thoughtful ones, and vigilant civil societies and everything else we know, you're kind of dependent on the tender mercies of whoever gets elected and hoping that they'll either be, you know, idealistic in wanting to honor democratic norms or incompetent in trying to overrun them. And so executive abuse of power and massive corruption are one common problem. Second common problem is polarization in one way or another. Usually it happens along ethnic or regional lines. You look at Kenya, for example, or Nigeria, although the leading problem in both of those countries, it's sometimes not adequately appreciated, really is corruption. And if you could get a hold of that, you could make more progress on the ethnic polarization. And Nigeria's made some progress in trying to manage this problem of ethnic and regional cleavage. I do think it's in danger of unraveling in the next presidential election because it's looking like it's going to be a straight-off contest between a northern and a southern presidential candidate, one Christian, one Muslim. There's a lot of potential for that to repolarize the country. It'd be much better if the president of the country, having served nearly 8 years, would have the wisdom to simply step down. And then, you know, economic mismanagement has been a big problem in a lot of these countries. Economic growth, and as a bridge to your second question, can do a lot to help lubricate these other problems. Anyway, I can give you a couple things I've written that elaborate on that. In answer to your second question, I think if we could you know, repair our political institutions and the functionality of our democracy, our ability to get a budget on time and so on and so forth, we could probably accelerate our economic growth rate. It's not mainly our political dysfunction that's holding back our economic renewal, but it's certainly not helping. And I would just, first of all, I mean, you know better than anyone, it's not like the Russian economy is built on very strong autonomous drivers of growth. We know what most of that is, and as the price of oil and gas declines, I think Putin's going to be in increasing trouble. I also think that if we could push, you know, the development of renewable forms of energy, it would help not only address the climate change problem, but it would just put more energy out there on the market and probably further depress the price of carbon-based fuels and a lot of the autocrats who depend on them for survival. And I'll just make one other point in answer to your question. The big variable that could, I think, reasonably quickly transform the situation and the perceptions of the situation that you have described would be if Prime Minister Modi in India could actually succeed in structurally reforming and opening up the Indian economy and unleashing something like, maybe close to the rate of economic growth that China has experienced. Many people think there's no natural reason why it couldn't happen. There was that tantalizing brief period in the previous decade early on when it looked like it was beginning to happen. And I think it should be a very high priority for the United States to deepen our relations politically and economically with India. Maybe that began to be done here last month, and to try and be a part of that economic, economic resurgence in India. China's growth rate is going to decline. If you don't know why, ask Jack Goldstone sitting here, and he can talk about some of the sociological and labor market problems that are confronting China now. But it can't continue to grow, probably even at 7% a year, not to mention 8 to 10%. So if India could just get to 7 or 8%, that would really begin to change the parameters. Right here.
Thank you, Leon Weinscheib, University of Wisconsin. It was very inspiring to hear about your calls about the inspiration of freedom, dignity, and self-determination. But it seems like everyone fighting against that ultimately pulls the ace out of the hole of nationalism. And whether it's the Russian style or the Bolivian style or some other style, the fact that it's not made here often is enough. Sometimes there's a little bit of an effort to gloss over a competing ideology, but underneath that, there's really a call to almost a primitive kind of nationalism. How do you have to fight that?
Well, I think the best way to fight it is by making democracy work. Every one of the 3 countries you mentioned, Russia, Bolivia, well, I'll throw in Venezuela and a lot of others, where you get these kind of resurgent nationalist or hyper-nationalist autocrats and pseudo-democrats rose to power. Putin, Chavez, Evo Morales, because the previous democratic institutions failed. And they were an antidote to it, and a popular antidote that was embraced widely in competitive elections. And in each of those cases, and many more one could cite, if democratic parties and institutions had found a way to renew themselves and reform, these kind of sinister options would not have been able to gain traction. So the best strategy is prevention, always. Once these things take root, it's very complicated, because if we challenge them too frontally, we play into the nationalistic narrative. So I'll just give you one example that I had to cut from my remarks because obviously they were too long anyway. We got a real problem in Latin America now, and I think, for a long time we weren't worried about democracy in Latin America. It was the region, except for Cuba and Haiti, was entirely democratic. It looked like it was consolidating. I mean, we know what the bad story was on September 11th, 2001, but the good one was the signing in Lima on the same day of the Inter-American Charter of Democracy, and it looked like, you know, Latin America was headed toward becoming, you know, some version in terms of democratic solidarity of the European Union. And then it all started unraveling, and you saw what just happened, that the Latin American states backed Cuba to be their candidate to be elected to the UN Security Council. Venezuela. That's what I meant. It's a disgusting development. And so the point is that we're not going to be able to counter that, okay? Not frontally. Democrats in Latin America have to do that. But what we can do is use our NGOs and our partnerships already with Democrats on the ground and support Venezuelan Democrats, just to give you one example, to engage their peers in the region and say, come on, you know, you made it out of authoritarianism with international assistance, and now you're pulling up the ladder and leaving us behind. What happened to democratic solidarity? What happened to your professed commitment to human rights? It's not, you know, the bad guys, the Norte Americanos, who are asking you to do this. It's us, your fellow Latin Americans, who are on the receiving end of all this authoritarian abuse. So I think that's what needs to be done, is that people in the region need to engage their peers in the region. Obviously, it's going to be a little hard for Ukrainians to do that with the Russians right now, but I do think there are a lot of places where that can be done.
Actually, following up on the Latin
We're going to get a microphone for you here.
Here's one right here.
Oh, we're getting one. We have another one coming, not to worry.
Following up on the Latin America question and going back to your advice that we need to devote more time and resources to making sure that states that have more or less crossed the line stay consolidated. Given our tendency to react to crises and to ignore places that are quiet, do you think we can get such a strategy moving forward? Because Ukraine was, all those problems were present in Ukraine a year and a half ago, but it wasn't on the agenda. It's only when a crisis breaks out that suddenly we devote all our attention to it. And with that in mind as well, do you think that an overfocus on Ukraine could lead to other parts of the world where our aid could be decisive in preventing that flip, you know, that we're not going to be able to keep that focus, that we're so devoted to crisis response we can't do the long-term
So, thank you. I think it's a smart question. You know, we're a big, rich country with a vast foreign policy and national security apparatus. It's not like we've got just one pot of money or one set of people who are able to devote analytic and programmatic attention to this. And if we deploy them to have a 10-year focus on Ukraine that's intensive, that's just going to diminish everything else. What it requires is, I think, presidential leadership. There's just no other way around it. A president has to make it clear that this is a priority for his administration and for the country, and that we have to have a strategy that's going to deploy in a lot of places, engage in a lot of places, deliver talking points to a lot of different ambassadors about how this is going to, I'm not going to say dominate the conversation in every country, okay? I'm not insensitive to the points you've been making, but be an element in the conversation. And not just, oh, I have to read this thing, Mr. Foreign Minister, so let me read this and move on. The ambassador's got to know that, you know, he needs to lean into it somewhat, and that, you know, we want the embassy to be giving some of these micro grants and to be tweeting and, you know, using all the instruments that we talked about in our in this book that the Council for a Community of Democracies produced, The Diplomat's Handbook, which has a really big toolbox of different instruments that can be used on the ground. And, you know, we got a lot of instruments we can deploy.
Right here, and then your microphone right here.
Larry, thank you, because I think you have shown a lot of interest and knowledge in Southern Africa, which is, which pleases me. But my question is, you spoke about translating appetite of democracy among the people. I think you spoke about Afrobarometer, that people in Africa are hungry for democracy. But how do you translate that appetite where there's no democratic alternative in a country like Zimbabwe, where the opposition leader himself is discredited? Do you go for representative democracy or participatory democracy until the right man or the right woman appears on the horizon?
Well, everywhere I think good can be done by, engaging on the plane of ideas, information, values, models, making it more widely accessible to people. Then I also dumped this from my remarks, and of course, in a situation like this, I can always claim to have deleted something that I didn't say. But I do believe very strongly, and have said before, that in the end, if we're serious about doing this, we need a particular strategy for every country, and we need to keep revising it periodically over time. Morgan Tsvangirai didn't look so hopeless and incompetent some years ago. He hadn't lost that luster in the preceding election before the last one. And we need to periodically take stock and see what are the biggest challenges to democratic transition. Obviously, a big one in Zimbabwe now is the need to reconstitute and refashion the political opposition, the party opposition. We can't do that for you. We can't choose your opposition leaders for you. We can't nominate the leadership of those opposition parties for you. I do think there's some things we can do to engage broadly among opposition forces, to provide neutral grounds for them to meet and talk, to gently encourage consolidation. One thing we know about democratic transitions, we absolutely know this, is that when the leadership is united and the opposition is divided, the authoritarian leadership is going to survive. When there are splits in the authoritarian opposition and in the authoritarian rule, and the democratic opposition pulls together and buries its differences, unites behind a common candidate, they have a chance at least of winning, either in an election or in protesting a stolen election or whatnot. They came very close in Venezuela last time. Enrique Capriles actually came pretty close to being elected president. And in Malaysia, Anwar, having united the opposition, Anwar Ibrahim won the majority of the votes in the last election. The only reason why the rotten UMNO coalition is still in power in Malaysia is because they've so badly gerrymandered the parliamentary election system that they were able to get a clear majority of the seats with a clear minority of the vote. So, I mean, these are, at least if we make you aware of this, maybe it'll, stimulate grassroots sentiment and pressure on the political leadership to pull together.
Larry, I agree with just about everything you said, which is not always the case. But since we need a strategy for every country, I want to ask you, what is your strategy for the United States? We're in a situation where you don't have to go to RT. Fox News paints our administration as weak and dysfunctional. The Supreme Court is opening the door for almost unlimited impact of money in politics. Under Bush, the United States grew very unpopular. Under President Obama, we're very unpopular. When you said democracy is the only legitimate way to have government, I can't agree. Francois Hollande and Obama would love to have the popularity ratings of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. So projecting national power seems to be an alternative source of legitimacy. The United States is not projecting either national power or competence. So what's the strategy to get the U.S. back on track? Is this just an aberration that we hope will pass, or do we really need to say something has happened and we need to reclaim democracy here?
So thanks, Jack. It's not an aberration. We've kind of been here before. You look at how democracy was working and not working, and the massive problems of corruption and state capture in the United States in the last half of the 19th century until the progressive reform movement began to roll this back with new institutional innovations. And it's not an aberration. It's been a recurrent problem in American democracy. I'll give you a few specific ideas, but I do want to clarify that, yes, there's very low trust in our institutions and a lot of disenchantment with our political leaders, and not only here and in France, but in a lot of other democracies. Approval of parliament and political parties is not much higher in Korea and Taiwan than it is in, or even not as high as in the United States. And I mean, this just seems to be a diffuse problem. But at the same time, you don't see any broad sentiment in any of these established democracies to switch the form of government to an authoritarian form of government. It's almost like, you know, we are, to use the famous phrase of Philippe Schmitter about 20 years ago and anticipating this somewhat prophetically, we are condemned to democracy. Well, you know, that's not good enough. I think we'd all agree. So I think we need to focus on what we can change in the near to medium term, and you know, be a little patient in waiting for an opportunity to change the things that are really not now changeable. So until we get a different balance on the Supreme Court, we're not going to be able to change the campaign finance laws enough to address some of the problems, though we can require more radical and immediate transparency in campaign donations. I think the big problem right now is polarization, and how we get at the problem of social polarization, geographic sorting, and the mass media, the echo chambers in the new media and the old media. That is a much more subtle and long-term problem. But I do think there are some dramatic things that we could do to depolarize our political system. And I realize, you know, this is a conference on international democracy, and I have to be careful not to make any partisan statements here in this building, but this isn't really partisan. I think that it is not healthy for our democracy to have become so deeply trapped in a duopoly of the two existing parties, and so immune to new entrants into the political marketplace. The system is rigged in ways that we would regard as undemocratic if we were looking at it externally in other countries. And if you doubt me, just take a look at the rules that make it virtually impossible now for any other candidate other than the nominees of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party to enter the presidential election debates. I think there's some concern and creative thinking that's emerging on how that could be opened up in a reasonable way that would stop well short of chaos. I think the big change that we could introduce, and that it is possible to introduce in any state in the United States, which would have consequences not only for the politics of the 50 states, but for Congress as well, would be to change the electoral system in the United States. If we keep the single-member district system, this will not require national legislation, much less a constitutional amendment. We could move, and there are many cities that have begun to do so. There are some initiatives that may start doing this at a state level, not toward what we did in California, which is the top two system, which I think has a lot of inefficiencies and problems, but to the more efficient and I just think more rational and democratic system of the instant runoff or ranked choice voting. If people can rank their candidates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and know that if their highest priority candidate, number 1, doesn't make it, then their vote will be transferred to the next choice, they will be more willing to take a flyer on a creative option, maybe somewhere in the middle between the extreme left and the extreme right. And some of these members of the Senate and House who are getting knocked off as a result of low participation, extremely ideological primary elections, and then, you've got, maybe because it's essentially one-party district or one-party state, a very highly ideological and uncompromising new member of the Congress elected. If a moderate incumbent could then come back and say, well, fine, you knocked me off, I'll meet you in the general election, without having to do what Lisa Murkowski did and run as a write-in candidate, I think the game would change. Now, you'd also have to do what Congressman Mickey Edwards strongly recommends in his book, and that is eliminate the sore loser rule, so that if an incumbent is defeated in a primary, he or she could still contest and get on the ballot in a general election. We've got to create opportunities, incentives to embrace moderation. That's the key. And Donald Horowitz has mentioned this as a major kind of institutional option for controlling ethnic conflict in developing countries. If it's good enough for Papua New Guinea, it should be good enough for the United States. And I think the two-party labels have virtually become ethnic identities at this point in the United States. If you doubt that, read the new research of my colleague at Stanford, Shanto Iyengar, which is showing that party identification or ideological orientation has replaced race and ethnicity as the primary driver of personal bias in the calculations of a lot of people, that people would much rather have their daughter marry someone from Mars than marry someone of the opposite party or ideology. So, we got to get at this in ways that are feasible.
Okay, well, we've reached the end of this part. We'll be able to pick up some more questions during our final discussion and concluding remarks, but thank you very much, Larry. Okay. Thank you so much for providing answers both to the United States and to world democracy problems. We're not done yet. Everyone, please sit down. We're going to still have a chance
three of you,
for a little bit more discussion, and we're going to have...
They have the cameras portrayed directly.
Not quite done yet. We're going to begin our concluding remarks now. And these are concluding remarks so that we can continue our discussion. And we're going to begin with Richard Kramer of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. So we're just going to have Mr. Kramer speak from the table.
Yeah.
Yes?
Is this on? Oh, great. Yes,
On.
it is.
And we're going to continue our discussion here.
Good afternoon. Thanks, everyone. It was unexpected that I was going to speak today, so thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank FPRI for allowing me to do so. I'm glad I wore one of my favorite lucky ties. But basically, yes, I am also a senior program officer at the National Endowment for Democracy, where I'm responsible for 3 countries in our greater Middle East, those being Iran, Afghanistan, and Turkey. I'm a practitioner. I've been working in the field of democracy assistance for about 10 years. I'm going to try to touch on some of the main issues that were addressed today on both of our panels and also in Larry Diamond's prescient remarks, and also some of my own insights and issues that I'd like to raise, which of course are my own personal views and not those of the National Endowment for Democracy. I think taking a step back and looking at this greater debate on whether or not you can have a dual-track approach, you can have a sort of more realist foreign policy while simultaneously pursuing democracy assistance and respect for human rights abroad. I'm no political scientist, but the way I've kind of seen humankind on its trajectory through all the millennia to where we are now is that there's an increasing self-awareness of the individual's fundamental human rights. That was enshrined in the Universal Declaration of 1948 of Human Rights, but the awareness amongst people all around the world in all different kinds of societies and cultures continues to increase. My experience working in Afghanistan for 10 years is that once you let that genie out of the bottle, you don't roll it back. And Larry touched on it a little bit. For the most part, you do not see functioning democracies or near consolidating democracies suddenly turn around and say, we're better off as autocratic, because the problem is that if you don't have a democracy, the ability to actually protect those individual rights of which people are aware is extremely difficult. And I think when we look at more recent examples like the Arab Spring, like what we saw in Ukraine on the Maidan, and also what I saw very recently in Afghanistan, from which I just returned, is that people have a sense of justice that they think that they deserve in this life. They'll fight for it. And if it's not there, they have a space, they need a forum to participate where they can actually realize what they believe that sense of justice to be. And very often it involves issues of economic development and income parity to a certain degree. It involves combating corruption, all of which cannot be achieved unless you're going to have rule of law, unless you're going to have a sense of accountability, unless there is going to be transparency in a government's doing, unless there's freedom of expression. The opposite will end up typically in some kind of instability and sometimes outright chaos. So in sum, it strikes me that in addition to the moral imperative of supporting democratic activists around the world, that it continues to be in the United States national security interests. And coming back to that briefly, looking at the 1980s under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, he was able to negotiate a safer world vis-a-vis nuclear arms, and at the same time continue to advocate for the respect of Soviet dissidents and Soviet citizens. So I just wanted to put that out there as something to consider in the ongoing debate as to whether or not we can have a moderated approach between the two. The issue of U.S. leadership on a global level continues to come forward. President Carl Gershman was very vocal on that. It seems there is some consensus about that here. It's agreed that it's needed. It's in our interest. My sort of takeaway from it is that at the endowment, we're basically, when we're looking at a proposal and determining whether or not we're going to recommend it to our board of directors, one of the fundamental questions that we ask is, if we don't fund this organization, if we don't fund this project, what will happen? And I think that's equally applicable when you're actually looking at what the United States' role is in supporting democracy assistance. If we're not there, who is going to back these activists? Who is actually going to step up and take the role? What will the result be? My estimate is that it wouldn't be a more democratic world, but more likely a less one. Of course, as Larry mentioned at the end of his comments and others touched on today, we kept coming back to the theme of we need to strengthen our democracy at home, and that there needs to be a greater sense of leadership. I would argue that there needs to be also a greater sense amongst, it's not just Washington, it's not just Congress, but that there needs to be a greater sense of common purpose and patriotism and service to the community in a bipartisan manner amongst all Americans. And I think, unfortunately, we've lost that. It's not the perfect democracy, but it's one where actually we kind of get the leaders that I think reflect our society. So if Congress is that dysfunctional, well then I think the first place we need to start is in the mirror. I also thought it was prescient or accurate to note that we can't have the military be increasingly taking on greater risk and getting involved in areas of development and even in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan to a certain degree assistance in governance. That's not their role, which means that civilians have to be willing to take on a greater degree of risk and that our political leaders have to allow them to do that. And then, yes, of course, people spoke about the issue, our panelists spoke about the issues of our deficit and the need for economic growth. And yeah, that's a given. We have to have that if we're going to succeed in this. So turning a bit more to the second panel in respect to tactics and how we go about doing this, there struck me as there was a consensus amongst our panelists that the best way you go about this is from the ground up rather than the top down. Any of you that are halfway familiar with how the net operates will not be surprised to hear me say, well, yes, I completely agree with that. And I think that's where we've seen the greatest success, especially given the budget of the endowment as compared to the U.S. government when it comes to supporting democracy assistance. There was some interesting debate about the issues of field offices versus grant-making institutes. And I thought that Melinda's suggestion that we might want to actually consider free versus not free versus Freedom House, or vis-a-vis Freedom House, was an interesting way of determining whether or not you just work with civil society or you actually get to a level where you're starting to engage the government. However, I would argue that if you're looking at a closed society and you need to pave the way, 1 minute?
Yes.
Okay. And you need to pave the way going forward. Sometimes there are elites that you can work with. You have to find them. Two, it does make sense to work the civil society within it, but sometimes in a more open society, if you don't have a field office, you can't actually provide the technical assistance that our core institutes like IRI and NDI do. And finally, in terms of conditionality, without conditionality, it's very hard in a country like Afghanistan or another country that's emerging from conflict to be able to pursue the economic and institutional reforms that they will. And we've seen that in Afghanistan specifically. So I've run out of time, but hopefully we'll be able to touch some other points in discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Our next speaker is Matt Rojansky, the director of the Kennan Institute.
Thanks, Will, and thank you again for making today possible. And Adrian and Larry, thank you for that phenomenal, thought-provoking keynote. I realize as I look at the devastation after our lunch extravaganza here that actually this is in some ways representative of one's state of mind after considering and consuming this much intellectual food for thought. I don't know that everything is stacked up nicely in little piles and cleaned up. And so that will somewhat be the shape of my remarks, maybe some scattered observations, but hopefully there's something there representative of the meal that we consumed. So number one, it's been echoed a number of times, is fixing the problem at home in order to address the challenge abroad. I see two dimensions of this that have emerged very clearly, and I don't know that I know there are a lot of proposals. I don't know that there's clear evidence as to what will work and what is feasible. Proposal A, if you will, is money in politics, right? You've got to deal with the corruption as we have it in our society, which is not identical, of course, to what we see internationally, but is close enough that it really undermines the power of our international voice when money is so present in American politics. And the second is this notion of moderation, as Larry called it. I like it very much because I was just up in New York last week talking to a bunch of the smartest and most powerful men on the planet, who are, of course, in finance, and talking about politics and policy. And they made the very reasonable point that one of the problems with voting is that your vote doesn't cost you anything. It has consequences, and it certainly does collectively when people take action through the ballot box. But people don't necessarily take the vote as seriously as they would if they, say, had skin in the game, if they were putting their money down. Now, of course, we can't vote with money because people have different amounts of money. But the question is, how can we help people to take the vote more seriously? And I think one way of getting there is to change the rules so that they have a stronger sense that, as you said, with this ranked order of choices or something like that, that the outcome will be more reflective of what people actually want and not some strange artifact of the way the rules are constructed. So fixing problems at home. Number two, sustained attention. Nick made the point. Nick, I don't know where you've gone off to, but the idea that we sort of have a crisis-to-crisis, very, very reactive policy, particularly when it comes to acute problems like Ukraine. And I'll grant you, Ukraine needs a ton of money and a ton of assistance right now and in the next half year to a year. But if Ukraine doesn't get 10 more years of serious attention, then I promise you, we'll have another revolution in Ukraine within this generation. There's no question. Because the problems there are really fundamental and they require sustainment. And on that problem, I might suggest something akin to what we do in so many other areas, which is to create a rating system. Rate the sustainment of the commitment of our political leaders to any given set of problems. How sustained is their commitment? Not how loud is their rhetoric, not how did they vote one time, but do they show sustained commitment over time? That, I think, may be very valuable in this area in particular. Third is sensitive engagement. Larry talked about a strategy that's driven by the conditions in each state. Here I would suggest, it doesn't take a genius. You'll always be right in Washington talking about the problem of stovepiping, the idea that intelligence, policy, regional expertise, and then ultimately the assistance givers don't communicate well enough with each other. The interagency doesn't work as well as it should. But I think here's an example of where we know that what we want is not martyrs, people who are willing to go and sort of fight a tough security battle and die and so on for American interests. We don't want sycophants. We don't want people who are dependent on American assistance giving for the long term. And we don't want Trojan horses, right? We don't want people who have essentially fooled us. And we've supported many of those in the past. In order to figure out in the complex web of real human life who, in fact, we're engaging with, you need a whole-of-government approach, right? That seems very obvious. And then lastly, this may be a very small idea, and it may imply an element of risk with which we're not necessarily comfortable. But I think we need to think about democracy assistance or assistance in helping to develop democracy in terms of many, many goods that are several steps removed from democracy. So the idea, for example, when you're dealing with Vladimir Putin's vertical of power in Russia, we know from our own experience, and many others in this room know, it's exceptionally difficult to wade in and interact directly with NGOs that have anything having to do with democracy in their names. The kinds of goods that you can offer are actually far removed from democracy and yet at the same time have a direct result that I think is very, very positive. And that is, the more that you open up the United States and the resources that come from the United States to ordinary Russian citizens, the sorts of things that they want, travel, business incubation, education, cultural exchange, etc., the more that the Russian government has only one choice, and that is to react in an authoritarian and obviously Stalinist way to close society. Now, it's a bit counterintuitive because what you're doing is you're delivering actually a net worse situation for Russian people. But I think it is a process, and in forcing the hand of autocrats everywhere in the world, I think ultimately we might be more effective at changing the way that people think about their own regimes, solely because those regimes can no longer pretend that they've invented a third way, something that is in fact autocracy, but that is dressed up as something softer and that we allow to work. We don't call its bluff. And calling that bluff is about action. It's not about rhetoric, because those of you who deal with the post-Soviet space know nobody believes our rhetoric anyway, and nobody's going to. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matt. And Ambassador.
Okay, I'll also try to be brief. The idea of this panel is takeaways that each of us from our own perspectives have, and they're differing perspectives. But it's also for you to have the last word. We'll finish exactly on time, but there will be time for your comments, if you keep them very brief. And we've asked Larry Diamond, even though he's not officially part of this panel, his magisterial presentation, every word of which I agree with, I should add. I think merits a seat at the table for any discussion that we have. Very briefly, here are my takeaways. Of course, clearly we need to rethink the American approach to democracy promotion and the broader question of support for democracy beyond the program tools that we often talk about when we say democracy assistance. The leverage, all the diplomacy, all the other things that were mentioned. Secondly, in my view at least, my conclusion, my takeaway today is the consolidation and further spread of democracy is evidently and clearly a core U.S. hard realpolitik U.S. interest. Of course, Nick is right. It's a one that you achieve only in the long term, and there are at times inevitable short-term trade-offs. But let's not let this be a false debate between core or hard-headed interests and some kind of moralistic crusade. It isn't. It's in our self-interest. That's who we are as a nation. A more open world, a more democratic world will be in our longer-term interest as a nation in the hardest core sense, militarily, economically, and in other ways. Thirdly, we do need a more realistic approach than we've had in recent times. America cannot be a Don Quixote tilting at every windmill. Instead, and I did give it the Latin American pronunciation in case any of you are bilingual, or the Spanish pronunciation, and they're a good example of a country coming out of authoritarianism successfully with a good deal of international support. So the U.S. should therefore be in the business of assisting and nurturing democracy. And as I said in my opening comments, that does not mean imposing it unilaterally. In fact, the costs of trying to do so hugely undercut, just the monetary cost, let alone the reputational costs, hugely undercut our longer-term objective of democracy in the world. Now to the specifics of strategy and toolkit. I won't go into many details, but we are talking about key takeaways. In order to continue to support democracy abroad successfully, the United States has to have a very long-term strategy. As Larry Diamond said, in different words, it takes a very long time. We pulled out of Central Europe too soon. We pulled out of South Africa and many other places too soon. It's a long-term commitment. Of course, it's very difficult for politicians. I think Matt's idea is brilliant. Rate them on consistency as to what they promised to do, and Senator Fulbright did for a whole, for generations. And there are a few politicians who have done that, and that should be the standard. But to create, realistically in today's world, a long-term, continuous U.S. foreign policy strategy, we have to go back to a bipartisan consensus. Despite Larry's idea that letting more competition into the system, we're going to have a two-party system for the foreseeable future. So therefore, policy will change as long as Washington is as polarized. We will not have a long-term strategy unless we get back to a bipartisan strategy on at least this set of issues. All right? How could we do that? Well, basically, we did it during the Cold War. We had a strong majority in favor of policies that ultimately won the Cold War. We have to go back to doing it again. Very difficult to do, but rather than trying to mend the entire U.S. political system, that's not the agenda of today's conference, I'd like to at least have us amend the question of how and whether and if and how we can get to a bipartisan foreign policy on this cluster of issues. It is fundamental to our long-term national security that we do so, and politicians who look only at the latest crisis should be measured, should be criticized, and think tankers and journalists and scholars and all of the other people represented, NGO leaders, civil society activists, should be constantly castigating those politicians who take their eye off the true long-term national interest of the United States and its foreign policy. So because of the reasons that these unfixed problems that Larry and others so well laid out, we've lost some ground over the last decade. And part of that is, of course, the counteroffensive that Putin and others have put in place, but part of it is our own credibility and our own taking our eye off the ball. Among other things, what should we do? I deeply and strongly agree with Larry's suggestion, and others in the panels also mentioned it. We have to have a much more effective use and a much more intensive and robust use of media to get the message across and to counter. I believe it's called Russia Today, isn't it? I was interviewed, by the way, back in December, and the skill and the vast amount of money they have with which to deploy this propaganda machine all around the world is extraordinary. How can we let ourselves be outdone? You know, we invented public relations and that kind of media generations ago, and we should beat them at their own game. That's one takeaway, and operationally. Second, and this goes back to Michal Korjan's excellent presentation from a Central European perspective, they feel abandoned. The West Europeans maybe felt too smug, maybe now they're feeling a little abandoned. Even Angela Merkel is a little concerned about what's happening right next door in Ukraine. We need to partner more effectively and more strongly with the Europeans, both Central and Eastern Europeans, and very, very importantly with the G4. Well, now it's G3, Italy, with the Germans, the French, and the British on this. This is a major national security challenge around the world. We cannot succeed in this without a strong transatlantic alliance in the broadest, not just the military sense, but in the ideological sense, in the operational sense of supporting democracy in realistic ways where there is fertile ground. Finally, one thing that was mentioned slightly but not emphasized enough in today's discussions, in my view, we need to have a much more systematic but also very subtle use of all the international mechanisms and treaties, the UN Charter of Human Rights, for example, all of the OSCE, the Helsinki agreements, all the agreements that went into the OSCE. We need to use these international mechanisms and charters, et cetera. It cannot be seen as a U.S. crusade. We need partners, and many others must take the lead, including international organizations, which are so often disdained by politicians. My 1 minute notice is not necessary. I have only 30 seconds left.
Very good. Okay.
Remarks. Thank you. So we succeeded in doing all of these things during the Cold War at huge cost. Now, taking our eye off the ball, you know, we're talking about a few tens of billions of dollars over the next decade or two to restore doing what we need to do in this. This is infinitely less costly than military interventions that create more problems than they solve. So, with all that, I thank you all for participating today and listening so far. Now, let's hear your views in the few minutes that we have remaining.
Okay. We'll open up again the floor for comments or questions. Have we exhausted the topic yet?
No, there's one right here, two.
Right here, okay. Right in front of me. Okay, sorry about that.
Hi, this has been alluded to several.
Just stand up and identify yourself, or turn to the camera and identify yourself.
Hi, Dominic Malone from American University. I've spent several years overseas doing democracy programs. This has been alluded to, but the issue of our military interventions over the last years. When I was in the Middle East, I heard a lot of confusion and complaints about mixed messages between promoting democracy and nonviolent means of solving problems, while at the same time our U.S. military is heavily engaged overtly and covertly around the world. And so how do we reconcile those two sort of messages we're sending to the world between democracy promotion and armed conflict?
I'll start. I think all of our speakers, maybe Larry will be best. Many of our speakers have addressed this. I tried to address it. We have to do more genuine democracy promotion and less armed intervention. But there are times when you have to back up your policy. If Russia is undercutting democracy in Ukraine, and even more so if they begin to intimidate the Swedes or the Estonians, et cetera, we have to be there militarily. So they're not incompatible. Larry?
Well, I completely agree with what the ambassador said. And I think there's a very simple rule. We reserve the right to use military force for one of two reasons. Either for our immediate security interests, which we have a right and a responsibility to our own population and to collective security to defend, or for reasons of urgent humanitarian imperative, like the responsibility to protect. Other than that, we should never use force to promote democracy. It should not be the reason why we use force, but it may overlap with those efforts. We're not going to do Iraq again, okay? We're just not going to. So I think that, I was there for 3 months the year after the invasion, and so I'm very sensitive to all the problems, but there is a sense in which I think in these kinds of discussions and debates, I'm sorry to use the metaphor, we're always fighting the last war. We're always fighting the last problem or analytic and geopolitical debate. Going forward, military intervention to promote democracy, that's not what we're going to have to worry about. But a problem like in Libya, where the transitional government came to our government and said we need security assistance and didn't get any response. They weren't asking for troops on the ground. They were asking for other things. That we need to worry about. A new Tunisian elected government that's facing terrorist incursion and terrorist problems on the margin, that we need to worry about. A new Ukrainian government that's trying to defend the rest of its territory that's still left and needs more military equipment and so on, that we need to worry about. And where you've got democracies or prospective democracies with some electoral legitimacy or some democratic commitment, and they need security assistance, and we don't provide it, I think it's a huge tactical or strategic mistake for the U.S., it's not being true to our own national interest, and it could be one more reason why prospective democracies fail.
I just wanted to point out, I think this is a hugely important question, and I don't think it's one to which there's an easy answer. And I hope that you're right, Larry, when you say that in Iraq won't happen again. And maybe it won't be in Iraq, but I'm not so convinced that the mistakes that human nature is apt to make are not cyclical. And I guess my recommendation in that light would be that one of many factors that needs to go into the calculation about the decision to use force is not just whether it's legal, is not just whether we're responding to something that meets a certain threshold of threat to our national security or threat to some important American value or principle, but also how is this going to be perceived? How does this fit into the broader project of the idea that democracies are better for their citizens? Because if at the end of the day we find that the world's leading democracy uses force more often or as often as authoritarian regimes, it really does chip away at the credibility of the idea and what we stand for, in the same way that if people starve under a democracy, the idea really lacks credibility. That's the post-Soviet space in the 1990s. We learned that lesson. And I think we have to be very careful to apply that lesson now.
If I may just briefly, having worked on Afghanistan, I want to sort of echo Larry's comments that I do think very much that Iraq was the outlier. I think colleagues have raised some salient points. The problem is whether or not there isn't going to be another Iraq. There are going to be countries like Libya. There are going to be countries like Afghanistan where we are going to intervene. And as much as we don't want to engage in nation building, that's going to be the de facto reality, because you can't just kind of go in and then pull your troops out again. We've seen what that does in Iraq's case, and I'm concerned about what's going to happen in Afghanistan. So this doesn't address the issue, I think, as much as sort of like use of force and how we're perceived, but rather to recognize that regardless what has happened in the past, we still need to look at these lessons because we are going to find ourselves in the next, hopefully not in the near future, but certainly within the next century, in foreign lands where we don't know people, their systems are foreign ours, and we're going to have to help them to try to construct something. And the only one that we know best and the one that's going to be as equitable or perceived by the people is going to be a democracy.
Right here. Identify yourself.
Hi, Alex Fisher, FPRI and George Washington University. So 2 quick questions. So it seems clear that authoritarian regimes have adapted to democracy promotion tactics, and we see this through repression of civil society, repression of media, the starting of their own civil society groups. So what should democracy promoters do creatively to get around some of these new tactics that perhaps the old tactics will no longer work because authoritarian regimes have become wise? And second question, perhaps more to Dr. Diamond. For those of us who are looking for dissertation topics in the PhDs, where is kind of new research that is to be done on democracy promotion? Is it just a lack of political will? Do we have the information? Or is there just still a lot that needs to be found out about democracy promotion moving forward? Thank you.
Let the 3 panelists deal with new
Richard,
tactics.
you should talk about Iran because that's where a lot of this down to.
Well, first off, thank you very much for your first question. It's an excellent one. I actually had a little bit of that in my notes because frankly, we're not doing enough. It's something that we could have an entire, at least 2/3 of a day's conference on, and how we are responding. Because unfortunately, and I say this again as a practitioner, we're slowly adapting, but not as quickly as we should be able to keep up with the pace of of the NGO registration laws, of the media onslaught, even at cultural levels. Finding ways to slander NGOs to make them look like puppets on the West on a variety of levels. But there are some ways that, at least in respect to working in closed societies, that we can combat what they're doing, but it requires openings like the ones we had in 2009. Essentially what we try to do in a place like Iran or in other closed societies is find those democratic activists that are able to build networks. And within them, you have, although it might not be an overtly political process, perhaps just one that's civic, you're finding like-minded individuals that learn how to organize, learn how to mobilize, and learn how to communicate so that when the eventual opening does come, and I do believe in my lifetime it's going to come in Iran, those democratic actors will be able to more rapidly seize on the political space as compared to, say, what happened in Iran in 1979, or in a lot of other countries that undergo dramatic transitions, whereby it's usually the nefarious anti-democratic actors that take advantage.
Talk about
No,
tactics?
The
Or
other 3
dissertation-
panelists can
Or
say.
dissertation topics.
Larry
right?
is
It's a
the-
desperate
Well,
need.
I
the
mean,
mentor of all the panelists.
we should talk offline in more detail because it's a rich and complicated subject. But I'll just say that I think one realm of interesting study is the possibilities and difficulties of promoting democracy in what could be described as the new authoritarianism. That is, authoritarian regimes that are pseudo-democracies, or borrowing the trappings of democracy to try and legitimate themselves at home and abroad, and manage democratic impulses. I think actually when you have a pseudo-democracy, it creates some opportunities for, or points of engagement for democracy promotion, because they have elections. Accidents can happen in elections, like the color revolutions and so on, but they also, they can also be very adroit tools of authoritarian management. So that's just one of a number of potentially interesting topics.
On the tactics question, that obviously is the subject for a manual, right, written by real experts. But my just experiential insight would be everything starts from awareness and information. So I would characterize actually the need for Western broadcasting not about promoting a specific idea or project, right? Our version versus Vladimir Putin's version or Xi's version. I think it's about just ensuring that people have a clue what's actually going on in the world, just period and full stop. everything else flows from that. So no matter how much a foreign society is closed down, if we cannot get a single boot on the ground, so to speak, for democracy promotion activity in a given society, well, heck, we can do a lot of stuff in our own country, including living well, but also saying, for example, hey, the doors are wide open to you. There are great programs for you here. We want you in our universities. We want you in our laboratories. But if people don't know that that's happening, then we've lost before we've started. So I think tactically, actually, the first thing you've got to do is make sure you have technological tools, human tools, expertise, et cetera, to get information on the ground.
Okay. We're going to take 2 points here. This question here and then right here. So right here. We're running out of time, so yes, go ahead.
My name is Meliha. I'm a fellow at NAD. I'm from Middle East, specifically from Gulf states, where all regimes are dictatorships. I'm so pleased to be here and listening to all these discussions and hearing the inspiring talk of Larry. My question is how America could keep its interest with the regimes in the Gulf states and keeps its commitment to stand up for human rights and help people there who wants to democratize their country. And another question, you know there is a human rights crisis in Bahrain. And do you think that U.S. doing well to help Bahraini people in their situation? Thank you.
Thank you. And right here.
Hi, Ira Strauss. A decade ago, there was a similar democracy promotion reconsideration conference, and some of the same dramatis personae I remember, others not, some differences. And I think somewhat similar results, that retail level democracy promotion was well defended and well adjusted, but the wholesale, the government policy promoting elections in the Middle East, that I think was not sufficiently reconsidered either that time a decade ago or today. Blame it all on the invasion of Iraq was already a prominent view, but that wasn't what caused the Palestinian elections to bring Hamas to power and destroy the chances for peace between Abbas and Israel. It was the election that did that. It wasn't the invasion of Iraq that led the Muslim Brotherhood to be in a position to win real elections in Egypt even then, and finally when it happened a couple of years ago. And it wasn't the invasion of Iraq that brought Iraq to the edge of civil war. It was the elections there that drove out Alawi and put in place a Shia sectarian government, which we finally got rid of by imperialist means this year, not by democratic means. So I think the reconsideration of the national policy, not the piecemeal democracy retail promotion, but the national election promotion has been insufficient. That's not to criticize the conference, which did many other things. It is to praise Alan Luxemburg and Nick Gvozdov for raising serious questions that weren't, let's say they weren't sufficiently answered, but I'm glad they were grappled with. And if anyone would like to reflect on the more difficult part of it, I'd be glad.
Okay. So, those two kind of general broad policy issues as well as the role of the United States in the Middle East, if anyone wants to discuss that.
Well, on the Gulf, obviously, if there's any place in the world where we have competing strategic interests that powerfully conflict with our interests and our values with regard to democracy and human rights, the Gulf is an obvious place. I don't think we've been serving our strategic interests very well by just rolling over and conceding to these transgressions. We have a lot of leverage that we haven't exercised. I mean, people worry. Some strategic analysts have said the obvious that, well, if we had sanctioned the Bahraini government for crushing the movement, they might have expelled us from our naval base there, and that would have been the end of the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf, and in the Gulf. And you know, they need that presence of the United States Navy there I think, more than we need to be there. It's not the only option in the region. And obviously, this goes back to Saudi Arabia, which is the one that organized the Gulf Cooperation Council intervention that crushed the Bahraini pro-democracy movement. But we just have not been using all the leverage that we have. And I think one could also talk about the most obvious convergence of our strategic interests and our values, which is the way the Qatari government has been supporting many of the worst Islamist groups in the region and in the world. So we all would wish for a much more forthright policy in the region, but I do think it's instructive that Obama came in promising something different and has, regressed back to kind of the norm in U.S. policy. I will say, in response to Ira's question, that on Iraq, I don't think you have the facts and the sequence is exactly right. The problem of polarization began long before that election. It got worse in that, but it almost went better, and the whole situation is so complicated there that, it can't adequately be addressed in this framework.
Well, we've reached the end of our discussion. I'd like to thank all of our panelists and all of our speakers today, and I'd like to turn the final word over to Ambassador Basora.
So my final word will, of course, include thanks to our hosts, but before that, let me make it clear, especially to those who said that this is the same old, same old. We had people at the conference you're referring to. There's been some further new ground plowed here. And the intent, and I think the actual result of this conference, is that we will be publishing papers. We will be taking account of the feedback, the very helpful feedback that you and many others have given us in the course of the day. We hope to, Christian Carroll, who's here, may publish some things in foreign policy, in the foreign policy or democracy lab portion of foreign policy. FPRI, through its e-notes and other electronic publications, may publish some versions, and then we may well do a conference report, an e-book online about this, and we very much hope to have continuing. I mean, these are huge questions. But the point is, this was not a conference about just talking past each other and hearing the same old, same old. If that's what you heard, you weren't listening. Your smile tells me you were listening. I know, good. It's not the same old, same old. We are very ambitious. We have a very ambitious president here of FPRI, an ambitious project director, and we have very fine and ambitious partners. So I want to thank Will Pomerantz, Matt Rojansky, and Madison Brady, wherever he may now be.
Ken Yalowitz, who's watching sick
and
at
Ken
home.
Yalowitz, who was to have been one of the panelists, but Richard for stepping at the last minute, for Michael Ciceri, who fell ill, and then Will for standing in for Ken. But we think of this as hopefully the beginning of an ongoing partnership on a set of issues that is deeply, deeply, deeply important to the long-term strategic interests of the United States. It's not wishful thinking. It's not naivete. It's for real. Thank you very much.